Hello and welcome to another episode of SyrupCast. My name is Daniel Bader, and as always, I am joined by Douglas Soltis, who is recently back from a short trip to London, England. How are you, sir?
Cheerio! What I learned.
Let's start that over again, because that was really bad.
What?
And
You think that was a bad cheerio?
that was terrible. And we're so happy to have him back from the nation's capital, I think, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, God. Okay, never mind. Ben Klass, welcome back, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Oh, the nation's capital. Yeah, I'm in the nation's capital. How's it going?
Oh, you thought I was talking about Toronto?
Yeah.
You thought I was
I
just
thought you were
being one
talking
of-
about London.
Oh, London. Yeah, no.
It's like,
Welcome
yeah,
to us never having done a podcast before.
Geography?
No, you don't need geography for a podcast because it's everywhere. It's in the ether. Today on SyrupCast, obviously, Rogers and Mobilicity. What happens now? We'll talk to Ben, who is a telecom expert, about how does the Canadian mobile landscape change now that Wind has significantly more spectrum than they did a few days ago. Now that Mobilicity is being incorporated into Rogers, what happens to those subscribers? Do they just continue on as Mobilicity subscribers, or will they be rolled up into Fido or Chatter? We'll talk a little bit about MTS's new total internet plan. If you haven't heard of that, it's actually quite progressive for a Canadian telecom. And we'll go back to last week a little bit about the Wall report and have Ben give us his take on it. We'll also mention, briefly, BlackBerry's fiscal Q1 2016 results. A little bit hit and miss, but there is some reasons for confidence. And finally, well, we'll see. We'll see if we have time. But Apple Music is launching on the 30th, and Taylor Swift. So let's start with you, Ben. Give me your kind of high-level take on what happened yesterday and earlier this week, given how quickly it all transpired.
Well, yeah, I think a good starting point is to take note of how quickly everything did transpire. Like, this is a pretty major deal. So what happened was that Mobilicity, the struggling, I guess, fifth carrier, which operates in a number of, it's in Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, and I think a couple other cities, maybe
Edmonton and Calgary.
They've been struggling since about 2013 in creditor protection. You might remember back in the day when Christian Parody was the industry minister, they blocked the deal from TELUS, and that sort of kicked off that whole Verizon's come into Canada thing, right? So Mobilicity had been in trouble for a long time, and there's been a lot of speculation about who's going to buy it ever since that 2013 sort of dust-up. TELUS has made a number of attempts to pick it up, and they've all been rebuffed by the government. So on Friday, I think Christine Dobby at the Globe and Mail there reported that something was in the works with Rogers, or on Friday it might have even been a potential buyer. But in any case, it seems like overnight, from the 23rd till yesterday, we got all the details. Announcements from Mobilicity, Rogers, and Wind. We have the federal government, that's Industry Canada, announcing that they've approved the deal. We've got the courts approving the deal, and we've got the Competition Bureau approving the deal. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and it seems like everything sort of just spilled out at once. There's a lot to process. That's a good place to start with it, right? The federal government doesn't move quickly, and neither do giant companies like Rogers. So my first thought is, how long has this sort of been in the works, and how much involvement has there been from the various parties in putting these pieces in place, right?
So I talked to the new CEO of Wind today, Alec, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Kraschik, and he mentioned that he actually brokered the deal, that he got in touch with both TELUS and Rogers and he wanted to do the deal with TELUS. He thought that it would actually be a better and easier time to do the deal with TELUS. because he sold Public Mobile. He was the CEO of Public, and before that, he was actually the president of Bell Mobility for 5 years. He brokered this deal, and he found that Rogers was just more amenable to hitting certain points of the deal. So, Rogers didn't want to keep as much spectrum as Telus did. They were willing to sell more of it off to Wind. Basically, let's give a high-level breakdown of what is actually happening, right? So, Mobilicity, 150,000 subscribers, 100 call center employees, 30 full-time employees in Vaughan, lots of debt. They are getting bought by Rogers. So Rogers is inheriting all of that infrastructure. They have 10 megahertz of spectrum, AWS spectrum, in five regions that they purchased in 2008 for around $260 million. They are going over to Rogers. But as a part of this deal, Rogers had to agree to sell some of its spectrum, of Mobilicity spectrum, to Wind. But back in 2013, Rogers also had an option to buy spectrum, the same kind of AWS spectrum from Shaw, which at the time was pondering whether it wanted to enter the wireless business. It turned out it didn't have any feasible way of doing so. So it's been sitting on a bunch of spectrum in Ontario as well, and the West, in Alberta and British Columbia. So part of this deal was that Rogers got to go through with the option of buying that spectrum, as well as the spectrum from Mobilicity, as long as it sold a portion of it to Wind. Now, Wind then benefited greatly from this. I think they got 20 megahertz in parts of Canada that they had no spectrum or just a tiny bit of spectrum. And now in parts of Ontario, they have 30 megahertz. So I think this is really the biggest takeaway here, is that Wind benefits greatly from just having greater capacity.
Well, yeah, I think that Wind does, Rogers does as well. It was interesting to see where that's. Industry Canada slapped up that the graph with a bunch of pretty colors. Actually, they're kind of ugly colors. They had pink for Wind for some reason. But it's interesting to see where the Mobilicity and Wind spectrum sits. It's directly in between the Rogers on the one side and the Telus on the other, right? So Wind has basically swapped some spectrum with Rogers in order to give them both bigger contiguous blocks. So, like, basically more spectrum that's right next to each other. They don't need different antenna equipment. They can sort of start putting that together. I'm sure you probably know more about this on the technical side than I do. But they could have done the same thing with Telus, right? Yeah. So I just be, I don't think Wind is clearly a pretty big winner here, but there's a lot of missing details. Like, for instance, I saw someone talking yesterday about how asking how much Wind is paying for this spectrum.
Yeah, they won't tell.
Well, I don't know about that. Like someone was saying, yeah, Wind isn't paying, or they're getting it for a song or something like that. Well, first of all, most of these carriers have got most of their spectrum for a song over the years, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. Wind's getting a heck of a lot of spectrum from Rogers here, and it's getting very complementary assets to the ones that it already owns. And it's saying that it's just getting them for free because Rogers wanted to get access to some Shaw spectrum in Vancouver and Calgary. I think there's got to be more to the story than that. If you go into the particular details of the way that these swaps were made, what you see is that Wind has been given all the Mobilicity spectrum, like it now owns all that, approved very quickly by Industry Canada, like we were saying. It owns now most of the Shaw spectrum. Like, Rogers has only hung on to 2 of the licenses, the provincial license for BC and the provincial license for Alberta. Shaw also had a bunch of smaller licenses in Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. But also hidden down in there is that Wind has done what's called subordinating the licenses back to Rogers right away. And subordination is the sort of spectrum management technical term for letting someone else use your license, right? So there's a number of reasons why they might do that. In the Rogers press release, they said that they could move the Mobilicity customers over to their own network immediately, but they're probably not going to be doing that. The subordination agreement goes until December 29th of this year, so the end of this year. And so what that tells me is possibly that Rogers is going to be keeping those networks running for a little while they maybe reconfigure their network, decide what to do with the Mobilicity customers, or possibly that Wind's being given that much time to come up with some money. You know, the amount of money that Rogers paid for Mobilicity is quite a lot more than what the earlier offers were, like 100 million plus more than the original offers, and you have to wonder where's that extra 100 million coming from?
So,
you know, so we have free spectrum and people paying more for things.
it's not free. I mean, Wind's CEO admitted that he paid for the spectrum, but just won't admit how much he paid for it.
Yeah, so I imagine that they probably, you know, there might be a tendency to under-exaggerate how much it costs. And that it's possible that extra money could explain why Rogers got the deal.
So Douglas, when you look at something like this and you think, okay, well, Wind now has enough spectrum both to either launch an LTE network or improve capacity in its existing network, how much do you think this plays into the whole, you know, we are now growing up, we're now coming into our own, we're now, you know, we can now enter negotiations on a relatively equal footing with the incumbents. Do you think that this will allow them to, you know, say, go to Apple or go to, you know, one of the, you know, some of the bigger companies and say, okay, now you have to pay attention to us. We're the real deal now.
I don't know if it takes them to that point, but it's certainly a step along the way. It's, you know, it's a step farther away from selling lightly loved iPhones,
which they did start doing today.
Yeah. So I think with this, the thing to keep in mind is that, you know, Wind has had an interest in what they got out of this deal for a relatively long time, and they were able to do it in, like, this is the classic three-way sports trade scenario, right? Where you have the third-party broker kind of making out better on the deal than they normally would by being able to facilitate it. I think what we've just kind of laid out in terms of how this was done is interesting, but I think, you know, this is what Wind is needed for a really long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least part of it. Now, how far that gets them towards leverage, and the fact that Rogers was willing to participate in this and to give Wind what they wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you point that out, because at this time last year we were getting a decision from the CRTC banning Rogers from, you know, basically forcing Wind into exclusive roaming agreements.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So a year ago today we had a much more adversarial environment, in particular between Wind and Rogers. And I'm sure, Daniel, you know, you've covered the CTS before. There was the sort of famous exchanges between Ken Engelhardt at Rogers and Ed Antikal, the executive regulatory guy at Wind, over that, you know, they were sort of really vicious to each other about tower sharing between the companies, and you know, oh, are you going to piggyback on my infrastructure? Are you going to build your own type of thing? And now we have, I mean, I think the signal, this is also a signal of a sort of shift in the management approach at Rogers, and also it's a big move for the new management at Wind.
But isn't it though? So, like, what would Rogers have done with the spectrum? Because they didn't need it, right?
Well, I mean, we just, in the run-up to this, Daniel was talking about Rogers slipping way behind Telus, was it, in BC? It's a major market.
Vancouver specifically, yeah.
So if you look at the CRTC's reporting on a province-by-province basis, the spend, what customers spend on their mobile service is considerably higher in BC and Alberta than it is in the rest of the country. It's like over $70 a month on average, right? This is the RPO figure. It doesn't necessarily reflect the price, but it does reflect what people spend on average per month, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like over $70 in Alberta, and it's 65, and it's, you know, in BC, sitting, you know, around 60 or below in the rest of the country, sometimes down to as low as 50. But Rogers is, if it's falling behind in these markets, the main spectrum it's held onto on account of this deal is a big I think it's 20 megahertz in each of those provinces. So I mean, I think that really puts them in a good position to compete and to improve the quality of their service in these markets. Right?
Yeah, I think. Sorry to interrupt, Doug. I'm looking at the charts that Industry Canada put out relating the before and after spectrum holdings for each company. And what's really interesting to me is that Rogers, they only had 10 by 10 AWS throughout the entire country. I mean, they didn't have anything higher than that in a single region. So what that meant was that, in Ontario they've been using 2500 megahertz as a capacity boost. But it seems like they also had a lot more spectrum in Ontario in other places before this. So prior to just looking at sort of the Rogers Ontario holdings prior to the spectrum swap, they had 20 megahertz in the A block throughout the entire country except for Saskatoon, and now they have 40 megahertz in all of southern Ontario. Sorry, 30 megahertz in all of southern Ontario. They have 40 megahertz in both Alberta and British Columbia. So that's, for them, a huge coup, because they now have double the spectrum that TELUS and Bell have. Well, they have 10 megahertz more than TELUS and Bell have. Not to mention the fact that they still have that 2500 megahertz band to work with.
Well, yeah, and there's a 700 megahertz too, right? And there's also, they've got their 850.
Well, right. So the 700 is interesting because they have more. They don't have more 700. They just have, I guess, better 700 than Bell and TELUS.
Well, Rogers was the big spender in that one, weren't they?
They were the big spender because they wanted the contiguous band 12 blocks. They wanted A and B together, whereas TELUS and Bell split the C1, C2, and then E and F, or D and E. I forget the band breakdown, but they basically got C1 and C2 in most of the country, and then they split the unpaired 5 megahertz in Block E. So for them, I mean, they were fine with it because they're just going to use that to pair it with their band 2, band 4, and just have extra downlink capacity. But for Rogers, this was the only way that they could improve their existing LTE coverage on existing LTE handsets, because when they started with 700 megahertz, when they started launching LTE devices, that not all of them supported 700 megahertz. So some legacy Rogers LTE devices are AWS only. Sorry, that was super technical. That was like a 4-minute aside of just like technical jargon.
No, it's good to have that kind of stuff, because the devil's in the details. While you're talking about this, I'm thinking, first, there's a long history, right, of Rogers has always been the dominant provider, and it's different from province to province, but they've always, I think, held the most spectrum of any of these companies. Yes. This is on a national level. In the 80s, they were given national licenses when the rest of the companies were given regional ones. They got more spectrum in the 90s. That was the PCS spectrum. They bought Fido in 2004, with 1 million customers, and another big chunk of that good PCS spectrum. So they were. Which one did Rogers? They didn't bid in the 2500 just recently. Is that right?
No, because they were at capacity in most regions.
So they're pretty flush with spectrum, but
sorry, they did bid. They actually bid in areas they didn't have they weren't at capacity. They didn't bid in AWS 3.
But so there's lots of technical details, but you can put it in the sort of this long-term trend of Rogers trying to hang on to lots of the spectrum, and you're talking about them getting contiguous blocks, and building up their downlink capacity, right? And I'm looking at where they're offering this, thinking, okay, here's the technical side. Why might they be doing this, right? And the areas where they're really buffing it up is places where they don't have video distribution, right? BC and Alberta. And at the same time, they're moving in with these Game Center Show Me apps and so on. So, I wonder if this might not be signaling Rogers sort of moving towards using their wireless network to compete in the over-the-top video market in places where they don't have their own cable infrastructure.
That's really interesting. Because they would be there would be a DMTO exemption if they were just doing unilateral or unidirectional broadcast, right?
Yeah, like if anything on the internet basically is it's subject to only really light regulation.
Right.
They can't do unfair dealing, like anti-competitive stuff with it, but they don't have to meet any of the sort of Canadian content quotas, and there's no regulation about swear words or anything like that, right? So it's a lot cheaper, right, to provide over-the-top service to Rogers if they have an existing network where they can guarantee a good quality for something like, say, Game Center, right? Than it would be to build out a cable network or to share the revenue, doing a traditional cable TV distribution model for those types of things. I mean, that's just speculation. I mean, I haven't seen inside the black box, but it seems to be sort of on par with where the company's going anyway.
So I want to quote you something that Alec told me earlier today. He said, regarding the fact that he now has an enormous amount of spectrum that was formerly owned by Shaw in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan. He has 30 megahertz of AWS-1 spectrum in Manitoba. He has more spectrum in Manitoba than MTS does in the AWS band. He said, "We have spectrum in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and if the folks at SaskTel and MTS want it, we'll sell it to them. The right thing to do is to facilitate a national fourth wireless carrier. We're never going to build in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. What I'd like to see happen is a ripple effect where if we and Rogers can team up and do this deal, we can sit down with all the providers across Canada, from Bragg to Shaw to Videotron, and do a spectrum swap that is in all of our best interests." What do you think about that?
Yikes.
Why didn't we lead with that before talking about contiguous blocks?
Well, because
Buried that lead, son.
it may never happen, but it's an interesting look at this kind of everybody's a buddy strategy that pervades the big four now, because Alec is chummy. He's chummy in a way that Lacavera never was with the incumbents.
Well, but
CEO.
also now has the opportunity to be, because the CRTC is like there's it's less of a dogfight now, right?
Well, CRTC's handed Wind, a victory on a silver platter, or whatever the mixed metaphor might be, in that roaming decision, right? Wind can afford to be a little more chummy with people, or a little more, strutting their stuff or whatever. But the fight's not over yet. There's still going to be lots of back and forth. The costing of, the CRTC is going to get into how much does all this stuff cost, and that is just a total shit show. It's going to take years. The usage-based billing stuff started up in 2011, and they're still working it out. There's still major complaints all the time about how much the wireline internet stuff is costed. But anyway, sorry, just going to what Daniel said there. That's the first time I've heard that, and I've been wondering myself for a while, being a Manitoba boy, right? Wind's holding the spectrum there. People talk about the fourth carrier. There's not really four carriers in Manitoba. It's Manitoba, Tel, and Rogers sharing a network. Bell and Tel sharing a network. Now we've got Wind talking about, well, we're not going to get in on that action at all. And it's a little disheartening to hear that he's taken this sort of traditional facilities-based, geographical sort of carving up of markets type approach. Like, we'll sell you the spectrum. You guys have your Manitoba market. We'll have our Ontario market. Because what I'd like to see really is maybe a pair of competing networks like what we've got right now that's a little more open to service-based providers like Google Fi or Ting, right? So,
yeah,
talking about you have your spectrum and you have your market, and we'll have our spectrum and we'll have our market, that sounds a lot more like old-timey telco monopolism.
Yeah. But what's the population of Manitoba?
It's like 1.2 million, I think.
Yeah. There you go. That's your answer.
Well, it's also a lot cheaper to put the cover areas, and you don't the towers just sort of go up in prairie land. And if you look, there's that lockcell.com website that does a real good job of measuring the wireless infrastructure, and I think Manitoba has got like the least dense network of anywhere, right? Something like the least towers per people, or
So
maybe
that
it's the most people per tower, or
mo-
something
so
like that. But
so there's a couple things to look at here. I totally agree that, in the long run, something like the proposal Obelisk put forth to turn Mobilicity into an MVNO, where they would basically be bought by Rogers and then have no spectrum of their own. They would just piggyback off whichever incumbent's network is the strongest and pay them a roaming fee. That's a possibility for companies down the road, only if the price set forth by the CRTC in November for domestic roaming, wholesale domestic roaming, is low enough that these companies can, still turn a profit on roaming on those networks.
well, no, that's Mobilicity. First of all, they don't own any infrastructure, right? They've just licensed everything out. So like Ericsson actually runs their network. They've got 30 employees. You said 100 in a call center and stuff. So what Rogers is buying here is the spectrum licenses and the customers. So I really don't understand that proposal at all, because if Rogers buys Mobilicity, like at most it could be a flanker brand, and then that the price is just going to go up. They're not going to be doing these, what is it, $20 for unlimited voice and stuff like that. To get access to those regulated rates, you have to have a license. The CRTC didn't go so far as to let MVNOs into the market. So I mean, you have to make that distinction, right? Down the road, we might get MVNOs. Well, if a company like Rogers wants to let the MVNO operate, right?
Right.
So I mean, that's when we're talking about these sort of geographical markets and these spectrum swaps and stuff like that. It's all the existing players deciding how the market's going to act, and there's still pretty big barriers to new companies operating in a sort of more progressive technological way, like service-based competition versus facilities-based, basically.
Right.
So if you're a Mobilicity customer, what are you expecting to happen in the next 6 months to a year?
I'm guessing that your price is probably going to go up eventually. Rogers didn't buy all those customers for nothing. They spent a lot of money, right? $450 million minus the whatever $140 million that they're going to get in tax credits, right? Going back to that subordination agreement we were talking about, how Wind is sharing the spectrum back with Rogers, it ends in December 29th. So I'm guessing whatever happens to Mobilicity customers, it'll be happening in the next 6 months.
One thing that Alec told me is that I echoed what a lot of our readers were worried about, that now that Wind has one fewer so-called competitor to worry about, that it's going to increase prices. But what he said is what I thought all along, is that Mobilicity was never really a competitor in any real way. I mean, they've been floundering for almost 2 years. Their plans were so low, but their network was so bad that their customers just were not even in the same realm as even Wind's customers are today. There were no great roaming deals, so that once you left a Mobilicity home network, you were just out of luck. It was a very different and terrible experience for most of Mobilicity's customers, but it was appealing to people who stayed within their local area, made mostly phone calls, not a lot of data, and were mostly prepaid. Many of whom didn't have a credit card, so it was a very different demographic than the one Wind is pushing for.
Well, I think I think that's probably a standard response. You remember there was that aggression between those two companies. What was it, earlier this year or maybe last fall, where they were going back and forth on Twitter. Wind was running like a Mobilicity promotion, trying to steal Mobi's customers. But they've been cash neutral, basically. Like, they've been breaking even on their day-to-day operations during this bankruptcy. It's that they can't service their debt. That's really had them in trouble, and they haven't really lost that many customers.
Yeah, okay, but so then let's tie that again when you're talking about cost increase, because like obviously the Mobilicity customer is the one being like, what is my cheapest possible option to have cellular access? So the assumption being that Rogers is going to raise those prices, like they bought customers, and then going back to ARPU, they want to crank that, right? What's the expectation that those people are going to stay as that happens for a long enough period for Rogers to make some of the money back? If these are the type of customer that are basically looking for just like, what's the cheapest plan for me to have a phone? I'm on Wi-Fi anyways. I never leave Toronto. Like, did Rogers buy customers that they're eventually going to just churn off?
Well, it's possible. I mean, but you look at their offerings with Fido.
Chatter.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Chatter one, so maybe you could say a bit more about it. But I know that the low end Fido plans have, I think I'm going to feel bad saying this, but are pretty cheap. I've noticed we're looking at like the low $30 range for a couple hundred minutes, right? So I know Mobilicity was offering its unlimited service, but people might churn to a Fido or to a Chatter. That'd be my guess, right?
Yeah, Chatter's positioned themselves as a low-cost, no-credit down type of carrier, even though they are pushing their customers to postpaid, and they just introduced data service on an add-on basis. So, Fido has positioned itself as the millennial brand for people with disposable income. Their data plans are not particularly cheap. I mean, you spend $50 or $53 right now for unlimited talk, text, and 1 gig of data in Canada. Whereas, on Rogers, that same plan would be, I think, $70 or $80. So
85.
Sorry, it's 65. I'm talking about the price of bringing your own device. So it's $65 on Fido for 1 gig, 53 if you bring your own phone. But these are not cheap plans for a little bit of data. Whereas the proposition of having unlimited Canada-wide talk, text, and data on Mobilicity has basically been what's attractive to its customers. But then you look at the fine print and you see that, well, it's not really unlimited. It's 5 gigabytes, and then they start throttling you after that.
And the speed, I mean, what you're talking about, they have, 10 megahertz of spectrum or something like that? So we're not talking about LTE speeds here either.
No, we're definitely not talking about LTE speeds at all. Mobilicity's been, I mean, we've talked about how Wind struggled to scale in places like in places like Toronto and Vancouver, but Mobilicity didn't even try to scale. I mean, the best speeds I ever got on Mobilicity, and I think the last time I used their network was about a year ago, were about 2.5, 3 megabits down and maybe 500 kilobits up. Whereas on a good day with a relatively sparsely used tower on Wind in Toronto, I can get 8, 10 megabits because they just upgraded their infrastructure. They have their antennas pushing out 10 megahertz, but they also have HSPA plus and in some places dual carrier HSPA plus. So they're not slow. They're just a lot slower than the alternatives.
Well, I think Open Media came out against this deal, and I think that there's a lot that sort of is fishy in it. Overall, I think people are it's the natural outcome, right? What was going to happen to Mobilicity? Well, this is they're in bankruptcy for so long. Rogers has sort of really swooped in, and Wind and the government and come together and come up with what I think is a pretty brilliant solution. But coming back to Doug's point, I think Mobilicity was doing a decent job of serving people who don't really care about their speed, who aren't really traveling, who just want the cheapest plan. And the unfortunate thing, and I think what sort of justifies Open Media and what we should pay attention to there, what justifies their position, right, is that there were 150,000 people who were happy with the service, who stuck around with this company despite all of its problems. And I think that those types of people, like, who's going to be serving them now? The next closest thing is Wind, but I think they're probably going to be looking to raise their price in any way possible now. No new, real sort of discount brands on the horizon aside from whatever the incumbents are offering. So I mean, I think that there is a bit of a loss here with Mobilicity, and yeah, that's my point.
Well, it cuts out the baseline expectation of what you can pay to have a phone in Canada right now is just increased, or like under the assumption that like Rogers will not leave. Or let's take the contra example then. So what if Rogers just bought this on ramp to like is it worth their time to try and squeeze more revenue out of Mobilicity customers, or is it better to just merge them into like forcibly give them a great plan so that they're made whole within the greater Rogers entity rather than jacking it up or leaving it?
Well, these companies have a long history of ignoring low-income people, going for the high RPU, and this goes way back into the early days of the telephone, right?
Mm-hmm.
But more recently, I think the most recent figures that StatsCan has put out show that not only is the mobile adoption in Canada low by international standards, and you can sort of mess around with the numbers, and people in Europe have more than one phone, people in Canada don't, although I think you're seeing that more and more. But one thing that is sort of unequivocal is that at the low end of the income scale, we're looking at like something like 60% of households in the low incomes earning under 50K have got cell phones. It's right around 60, whereas above that it's in the 80s up to 95, right? So the loss of a company like Mobilicity might just be a drop in the bucket in the overall scheme of things, but to the people for whom that's their only option, right? I think it does spell a bit of a bad development, because the rest of these companies, they're not they're focused on raising RPU.
Yeah, because so we were talking last week about the difference between service and the expectation of that service and the cost, that kind of value proposition. And we're saying a lot of like Mobilicity was so bad, Mobilicity was so bad, Mobilicity was so bad, but the customers, the people that are there because the value that they get, base connectivity at a certain price point that's what they want.
But
they don't
I mean,
want
did we ever really nobody knows how satisfied these customers were. They may have been staying there because there was nowhere else to go, because they didn't have a better option. But
right. So, but how does taking that option away put them in a better position? These people.
Yeah.
Well, we don't. I mean, okay. So we don't know what's going to happen with Mobilicity. I mean, right now, the word is that Rogers is going to keep the company's brand intact for a while. I think we can look at Public Mobile's transition into Koodo as a direction that Rogers will take it. They'll probably end up transitioning their Mobilicity customers into Chatter or Fido, give them an option. I mean, it's helpful that it was a GSM-based network rather than a CDMA-based network, because there was an uproar over the transition between Public's old network and its new network, because they forced everybody to buy new phones. Whereas I think most Mobilicity phones will work out of the box on Rogers. Actually, I don't think that's true, because Rogers doesn't own any 3G, doesn't deploy any 3G service on AWS. So it'll depend on whether the Mobilicity line of devices supports 3G over PCS. But I think most of them will.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of uncertainty, people wondering where their phone service is going to come from, or whether they might get hit with one of these types of things. And sorry, I just wanted to ask you, are they shutting Public Mobile down, like as a brand?
Yeah, Public has transitioned into it hasn't launched yet, but if you go to publicmobile.ca, you actually will see a new SIM-only brand, and there's a lot of I have some inside news on that I can't share, but it's basically going to be a bring your own device only service where you just buy the SIM card and then spend what you want on a combination of voice, text, and data. You can choose not to buy voice, you can choose not to buy text, and you can just get data like like what they may offer in Manitoba, but you get a bigger discount the more services you purchase. So it's not going to be cheaper, it's just going to be sort of more convenient.
Purely a la carte.
It's all a la carte, and it's all prepaid, so you buy your service on a 7, 30, or 180-day basis. I mean, it's actually kind of cool. Like, I like the fact that it exists. It's just it hasn't launched yet officially. It's in beta right now.
Well, maybe they'll move in. I mean, I think the one space where you are seeing some competition these days in wireless is with the flanker brands. So
Yep.
maybe with the Mobilicity customers up for grabs, and TELUS feeling the sting of getting denied the deal, maybe they'll move into sort of try and pick up those customers. Although
They denied the deal, or were they just not? The terms weren't right.
well, I mean, they were sent away a number of times quite publicly over the past couple of years, right? So Rogers just TELUS got swooped here. Basically, I think that's what happened.
No, that's well, according to Alec, that's not what happened. TELUS wouldn't concede as much of the Wind spectrum, or of the Mobilicity spectrum to Wind as Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
TELUS wanted to keep more of it for themselves, and Rogers said, "That's fine." Wind basically came to them, to both carriers, to Rogers and TELUS, with a plan and said, "Okay, here's what I propose. And if we bring this plan to the government, it's more likely to be accepted than if you just propose to buy Mobilicity outright without divesting any of its spectrum."
Mm-hmm.
So TELUS, apparently Darren Entwistle said, "No, I want to keep X blocks of spectrum," and Rogers said, "Fine, we'll give you most of Mobilicity's spectrum." Well, the fact that Rogers had this Shaw option made it more attractive to Wind, obviously. So
and
that
presumably to the federal government as well.
And to the federal government, because there was this unused spectrum just sitting out there, and it wasn't a little. It was like, in some cases, 20 megahertz in Alberta and British Columbia. So they wanted to get all of this spectrum put to use as soon as possible.
Yeah,
so
without the embarrassment, right? I mean, like there's build-out requirements here, and I'm not sure exactly what they were for AWS, but surely Shaw was butting up against, a situation where they'd have to be disciplined, saving things for the government here. And Industry Canada has very capable, like their spectrum management division is right on the ball with all this stuff. So.
Yeah, what was I going to say? Wind.
So about TELUS. TELUS is rolling the deal.
I forget. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about. Oh, sorry, it was 7 years. The minimum rollout was 7 years for AWS. So they were definitely butting up against it. Let's talk a little bit about this Total Internet package that was launched recently, Ben. You said that this is one of the first you've seen that gives unlimited internet at home and on a smartphone in a single package for Canadians.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you're talking about just now with the public mobile build your own type service, I mean, I think that's sort of what MTS is going with here. This is a service that MTS offers. The baseline product that you have is a home internet subscription and a smartphone. You can either get the smartphone from them, or you can BYOD. But basically, I think what MTS is saying is we're going to provide you with a data link across all our networks, home internet, mobile wireless, and they've got this big Wi-Fi sort of network, bunch of hotspots, competing with Shaw in Winnipeg, and probably Brandon too. That's a smaller town, I think 30,000 people. Second biggest in Manitoba. But in any case, what MTS is basically saying is, okay, we've got all these networks. You want an internet connection, so we're going to sell you as part and parcel one sort of service on your bill, a connection across all your devices. So we don't care what device you use. You're going to have unlimited internet on all these devices, right? And I think it costs something like the baseline price is $60. and then you pay an additional $25 per smartphone that you attach to the line. So $60 gets you your home internet, and it's 10 megabit per second, which I know is pretty slow, but you can upgrade it to 25 for $7 a month, or I think to 50 for additional $15 a month or something like that. But in any case, I mean, I think it's really interesting because for so long we've seen voice as the main service, or home internet as a sort of discrete service, a different thing that you might buy as part of a bundle. But what MTS is really saying is we're just a pipe. People just want this internet connection. They want it wherever they are, and they don't want to have limits on it. And I think, I mean, comparing this service to the rest of the country, it's really quite innovative. It's quite a lot cheaper than it is in the rest of the places. There's no limits on it. And I mean, I know I sound like I'm doing an ad roll for MTS right here.
/Manitoba.
/Manitoba, yeah. Well, it's friendly Manitoba, right? Got to represent.
Manitoba, we're just a pipe.
Yeah, there you go.
Connecting the nation.
Connecting the oil from the west to the east as well.
Connecting the nation in a province that has 1 million people.
But so I think it's pretty cool to see a company do this. When here in Ontario, I'm getting ads in the mail from Rogers and Bell. Bundle your cable TV together with your home internet for $100 a month or something like that. And MTS is talking about, well, you get your internet, and you can add TV on as well for $60 on all your devices. I wish I was still living there.
No, you don't.
But the service is slower. I mean, it's a lot slower than it would be in Ontario, right?
But let's even compare that. So this is like my dream is like tech savvy, doing something like this down the road. Because like just comparing those prices, like I pay, what is it, like 40, like around $50 a month for similar speeds for home internet. Via tech savvy. So for $20 on top to have that with everything else, like, good God, what were we saying before we started? Just comparing that to the Bell pricing. Like,
so the cell service. So what we're talking about here is just data. So if you want to add your voice on, it's extra. So I think I did a bit of a comparison last night. And I figured that the MTS service was going to cost you, if you wanted to have the unlimited voice, the home internet, and the unlimited data. For MTS, it was going to cost you about $100 plus tax for one cell phone, one internet connection, unlimited everything, including voice, right?
Amazing.
Bell doesn't offer an unlimited wireless plan, so I took a look at their $90. Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me backpedal there. The $100 with MTS is what you pay all in with a smartphone, not including voice. The same thing for Bell. I did $90 for 20 gigs on their mobile, like their internet-only flex plan.
Yeah.
Right? $90 for 20 gigs is the closest you can get to the unlimited, right? And then $55 a month for their 15 megabit internet service, which is the closest comparable to MTS's 10, but that comes baseline with a 50 gig limit. And it's like, I just got an Xbox One. The digital download that came with the box was 90 gigabytes. Right. So it's like 50 gigabytes. Like, I don't understand how they're selling internet plans with 50 gigabytes. So add an extra $30 on there, and what we're looking at is $100 from MTS will cost you $175 from Bell for a comparable thing.
Now, understandable, like that's, were they to bundle, there'd probably be some price smoothing, but that's significant, right?
The thing is, with Bell and Rogers and Telus, is that they bundle things, but they do so in a very shady and old-fashioned way by bundling things with 3-month discounts on a 2-year plan, or you'll have to commit to 3 years of service.
Yeah.
In order to get that discount going forward.
Yeah, we'll take $5 off your bill for 12 months.
Can I also I've been looking into this actually, and I know this wasn't on the talking points, but have you guys seen these? hello, happy Rogers lady. I never really like. I don't know what she's doing that she's so happy on her computer, but
What else could she be doing?
yeah, this is like one of those deals, and Bell's offering a similar one. I've noticed contract service for wireline, right, which is I think relatively new. So there's termination fees.
So they're doing what they did with wireless pre-code.
Yeah, pre-code, and
wireline.
just as the CRTC is creating this basic TV thing, they're getting people locked into contracts now, so that when next year in March this basic TV thing comes along, people will be like, oh, I want to switch. And then Rogers starts talking about, oh, sorry, $200 cancellation fee. And for the bundles, it's actually interesting. I was just in the Source buying this fancy no-name brand headset for our conversation.
Beats by Mobile Syrup.
And they're Beats by Mobile Syrup, yeah. Well, maybe you can buy the brand from Apple.
Yeah, right.
They're talking about there's a cancellation fee for the internet and for the cable, right? So when you sign this bundled contract, you're looking at double cancellation fees, okay? Which is, I mean, if I was a big company who was doing this type of thing, I'd be looking for ways to loopholes in the regulations and stuff like that, but it's kind of scummy.
Why? That's why everyone hates you. That's why people
so old-fashioned.
Why? No, like if you like no.
Also,
yeah.
why? I don't understand activation fees. What is an act? Why do you need an activation fee? Let me read the full details. It says when you buy this bundle, you get unlimited internet usage and access to Rogers Nextbox for 2 years.
Discounted access to the Nextbox. That's on top of the advertised price, which I actually think is probably illegal. Sorry to cut you off there. I had a long conversation with the customer service, and the Nextbox costs an additional $18 after the discount on top of the advertised price that they're charging you.
So it says discounted Nextbox rental, but they don't include the cost of the Nextbox within the price.
Yeah, so this $62 a month that they're advertising right here for the first 3 months, and then in the small print that you probably can't read on my low-resolution computer, $105 afterwards, that doesn't even actually include an additional $20 that you're paying for the cable box.
So this reads like a 3-year contract on wireless did about 3 years ago. An early cancellation fee applies if, for any reason, your internet service is canceled prior to the end of the term. And this is illegal in Newfoundland and Quebec, so it says not applicable to residents of those two provinces. The early cancellation fee is
not
$15.
Applicable where illegal.
The ECF is $15 per month remaining in the term to a maximum of $200 if canceled during the first year, and a max of $100 if canceled during the second year. So this is basically it's an arbitrary number that they're applying to early cancellation fees.
Doesn't have to do anything with the equipment because you are still renting your cable box and your which is probably integrated with the modem. So it's not like in wireless where you're getting to own the device at the end.
Yeah. So I have 2 core takeaways from this. First, I really, really need to return my Bell router. I should get on that. Second, we're all moving to Manitoba.
Manitoba, what?
Well, maybe these. Yeah, I don't know. I've been going on about this point for a couple years now, right? It's the same thing, way cheaper in these other places.
But in the other places where there is no incentive to not be a jerk.
Well, I think there's these are 100-year history of being public companies, sometimes owned by the government, whereas you've got Bell with 100 years history of being a private company, beholden to shareholders. I think there's lots of ins and outs. Hard to explain. There's probably a higher income levels, so people willing to spend more in Ontario and BC. But this.
But no, forget the cost, right? Because even when we were talking about ARPU in BC is higher, well, it's also really expensive to live in BC, so pricing expectation just rises, right? We're just talking about the simplicity of hey, you want your stuff? Duh, obviously. Here's your stuff. Here's how much it's going to cost a month. Don't worry about it. Versus reading the fine print to understand what it is you're paying for, what you own, and what you owe them. It's just it's a methodology beyond pricing.
It's predatory, yeah.
Yeah, it's predatory because it's not saying, hey, we're going to give you a great service. Here's great value. It's worth more to pay $10 a month. It's all these little fees and all these little overchargings on billings, which at an individual level is a small amount, but nationwide adds up to a huge chunk of change. Before the government steps in and say, hey, the thing that you were doing that we told you we were going to change, you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, well, in terms of, it would be nice if the government didn't have to step in on these kinds of things. But
that's why we have government, right?
Yeah, well, it's always been that way. Like these companies, the people who work for them in the regulatory departments love to go on about the free market and don't interfere in the market and so on. But it's always a dance between the state and the industry particularly in terms of industries of national importance. But where it's going with this, if they want to persist in these types of things and pick out the loopholes, yeah, you guys are right to call me on saying why would I do that if I was in the office? Because it's really stupid, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see an integrated service provider code coming out of the CRTC. They're already getting ready to look into the Ombudsman, the Commissioner for Complaints for Telecommunication Services, and don't even ask me to do it in French. But if they're going to start so blatantly trying to sort of skirt the spirit of the rules in one segment of the market when they're not allowed to in the other, would you be at all surprised to see an integrated telecom and communication service provider code of conduct?
I wouldn't, and there's been indication that they're on their way to doing that. For example, they've prevented, they now prevent companies from charging for paper bills on the wireline side and the cable side, and they also force companies like Rogers to allow cancellation on the day of, like they do under the wireless code, whereas prior they had to give 30 days notice to canceling. So these are small issues that are essentially being built into a wireless code piecemeal, and eventually I do see that, especially once the Let's Talk TV basic bundle comes into effect, I would definitely think that the CRTC will say, okay, well, let's work with the government. Let's start a consultation with the providers and work with the government to get something else on board, like the wireless code, because it's working.
Does that require a new kind of government body with a mandate to do that? Like that we're not talking about regulation anymore. We're talking about the creation of, this is law.
Well, they've already got the ombudsman, the CCTS, right? So that's it's not created by law. I think it's, first of all, it's like I think a private company that is funded by the telcos, and that it exists on encouragement of the CRTC. No, but I've spoken to them on the phone. It is independent. The fellow who runs is in charge of the place. The name of Howard Maker, I think, is a very smart guy, and is dedicated to his job. But in terms of what you're saying, one would hope that instead of building it up piecemeal until we have this sort of giant mishmash of regulations and different little things that apply to specific carriers or specific types of services, you think that they would see that coming and maybe try and consolidate and do it in an efficient way, right? And
right.
And as it stands, this commissioner, they're already considering whether to expand it from just telecom to include television service as well. So Doug, maybe, you'd hope that they wouldn't need some sort of big legislative overhaul to make that happen.
Yeah, because there's more than one dumb pipe now in the 21st century. Like, it's just a series of tubes, man.
Tubes.
So I want to clarify something that Ben said just now, because I think the CCTS would take umbrage with the classification of being a carrier-funded organization. They're not a carrier-funded organization in the sense that the government hasn't, basically the government has oversight over the CCTS, but then the Rogers, Bell, and Telus are just funneling money like they do into the CWTA. The CCTS is a non-for-profit, and it's basically
yeah, but it's the money that pays for it comes from the telephone companies. That's all I was trying to say.
Right,
I wasn't trying to say it was controlled by them or anything.
No, but the money comes from it as an externally mandated fund by the CRTC, right? So the CRTC has said, okay, you need to put aside some money from every customer every month, or
Gotcha. So
whatever.
The telecoms have no control over the budgeting or spending.
But
the telecoms have to basically adhere to the amount of money sent to the CCTS based on a formula that it works out every year in its budget. So
yeah, there's always a formula, you know. But I mean, at the end of the day, most of the money that pays for the CRTC comes from the telephone companies, and most of the money that pays for public interest groups. And I should stop talking about the money because people will be pissed. But this is a fact of this, is that that's the only point I'm trying to make.
Right. No, I don't disagree with the point. I'm more just saying that if I don't want people to get the impression that the CCTS is in any way manipulated by the carriers, because from what I can tell and from what its own filings show, they're not.
Or yeah, it's not, but not even manipulation. Just clarifying whether or not there's a direct funding relationship, because this is very different, say, than the federal government deciding how much money the CBC has to be a body.
Right, but Rogers can't. So Rogers
it's like
and
paying
Bell
your union dues, essentially. Like to be a telecom, you have to pay a few dues, and they go into funding these organizations which help regulate them.
Yeah, I think that's
pay
a good
a few
way.
dudes, and they go and break some knees, and then
Not dues, not dudes, not ranchers.
Okay, so let's finish up with a little discussion on last week's. Sorry, let's talk a little bit about the BlackBerry earnings, because I think that's interesting.
All right.
Douglas, you were at an IoT event yesterday for BlackBerry's partnership with the Mackenzie Center of Health, or Mackenzie Health Center.
Mackenzie Health in
Mackenzie Health.
Richmond Hill, which is not in Toronto. I learned
The hard way.
way to and from. Good Lord.
That's where I grew up, so I'm familiar.
Really? So you're not from Toronto?
No.
That is not. Like, I was surprised there wasn't a Porter flight.
Well, there's a Go bus. So.
That's all I have to say. Do you want me to talk about the event now?
Yeah. Like, let seethe for a second and then continue.
Oh, okay. So, this is BlackBerry's been talking for a while about getting into IoT, having owned QNX, which is a operating system which powers a variety of devices across industries. So it makes sense for them to try to monetize that more efficiently. There's actually a really great article, a really great interview done on the Disruptors, the BNN show that BetaKit has partnered with John Chen, talking about their desire to be a player in IoT. There's a few, I think 3 verticals that BlackBerry's trying to play in with this. One is like transportation, one is healthcare, and I think the third is government. The healthcare stuff is a little less farther along than some of the other IoT industries. So specifically in Canada. So Mackenzie Health is this kind of forward-thinking body that's been working with I think it's the Ontario Centre of Excellence to do these phased rollouts of basically smart health technology. So phase 1 was connecting smart beds and providing information on just like patient information, people in the beds. Phase 2, which was the rollout yesterday, was essentially connecting that information with essentially a BES and mobile devices. So the right information is being routed to the care providers, the doctors, at the time in which they need it. So they don't have to use pagers anymore, or they see broadcast information of alerts across the board. So provision to your device based upon a series of rules. The doctors and care providers are alerted when they need to know, and then there's also integration opportunities with patients from their mobile devices as well. So it's basically, phase 2 of health tech in Canada is dropping a BES and some smartphones and connecting those slightly to some of the connected devices.
So I assume the doctors are using BlackBerry phones.
Yeah. So there were I think 3 partners with it. Yeah. So there's Cisco, which is just doing all the networking stuff. BlackBerry, which is doing obviously the mobile smartphone component and the BES provisioning, and then ThoughtWire, which actually is doing the smart device connection between the medical systems and then routing that information through BES. So in this situation, BlackBerry is only a communication platform. Although there are tons of medical devices that are running on QNX, in the sense that like so many things that we don't even know about are running QNX, they are actually not smart. Do not have the capacity to connect to an IoT system. They are kind of like inert. They're dumb smart devices, is the way I think I described it in the write-up. Unlike, say, cars, where QNX has a lot of headway, and where kind of BlackBerry has started with their IoT platform, which were built from the beginning to receive kind of like over-the-air software updates or to be updated when they go in for servicing. A lot of this medical health tech is kind of like, hey, you buy it once, you use it for 15 years, see you later. Like, it's running the base level OS, but there's no way to connect it. And then secondarily, the companies that build this kind of stuff have yet to adopt the mentality of, say, automobile manufacturers, where they're looking to have, like, once you make smart tech, once you have something that's running an OS, there's a bit of a responsibility to kind of service that, update it, maintain a relationship. So I was speaking with the BlackBerry's created like a kind of like a healthcare committee internally to kind of understand the roles and requirements of what the industry needs in Canada. And part of what they've been doing is just going around and kind of speaking to these companies to get them to test the waters on whether or not they're looking to and understanding the value of building devices that you have a relationship with over time. So it's a weird thing where, like, yeah, QNX runs the world, but BlackBerry can't necessarily capitalize on that yet and profit from it. Which is why they're using an intermediary.
So, I mean, let's talk about that, because BlackBerry's profit has been a widespread cause for concern over the last few years.
For half a decade now.
There is no profit. They lost money in the last quarter. They only sold 1.1 million devices, but the one shining light in a sea of darkness is the 150% improvement in software revenue, and they're on target to breach their $500 million software revenue goal for fiscal 2015, I believe. So, what happens when BlackBerry no longer sells any phones? Because they recognize the revenue from 1.1 million phones, and that's still made up 40% of their overall revenue, which is lower than it has been ever, but it's still 40% of their overall, $658 million take home. So
they haven't sold this few phones since like 2000, since I started writing about BlackBerry.
2007.
Oh, okay, so a few years later. I thought it was like 2005. But that's part of the plan, right? So this is part of the transition towards being a more software as a service company. And I'm not saying like, oh, BlackBerry's capacity to play in IoT is a they're never gonna get it. It's just it just demonstrates how early this is, and in this particular vertical of IoT, IoHT, the Internet of Healthcare Things, which is a ridiculous acronym smushed into another ridiculous acronym. So I think the takeaway for BlackBerry from this is that they are well positioned to handle this, and like the McKinsey Health Body is a very they speak the language of tech very well, and they understand that. There was one reference during the panel conversation about them using a lean methodology to kind of like better enable decisions along implementations of solutions, which is you don't think about people in the healthcare industry understanding like core principles of technology development. So they're partnering with BlackBerry wasn't kind of like a hey home family thing. Like BlackBerry is providing a useful service here, but it is just the service that they've always been providing, which is communication and security provision to essentially local networks. The fact that a company like ThoughtWire has to come in and connect those devices to the communication infrastructure that BlackBerry's always had points to the opportunity, and then where BlackBerry is, and I think where IoT is in healthcare right now. It's early, but it is kind of this thing where there's been a lot of changeover in BlackBerry's IoT division or divisions, a lot of shifting in the leadership, and announcements that have they're still in their kind of beta trial of a thing that they announced, like Project Ion, for like last year. I think it was supposed to roll out in like November of last year, and then Alex Saunders, who was leading that, left the company, works at Microsoft now. So they're still sorting it out. So the idea that that revenue for next year is going to be hugely IoT, I think it's still too early.
So I think BlackBerry still garners so much attention on Mobile Syrup and elsewhere. Everybody wants to talk about the company as a smartphone manufacturer, but I think it's getting closer and closer to the time. I mean, it's maybe only 2 or 3 years out where that portion of the company will be so will be so unimportant, or such a small percentage of its overall revenue, that we'll really have to talk about it like we do IBM today and HP. And to some extent Microsoft, not as a hardware company, but as a company that touches mobile, but through so many different, more ethereal areas, rather than here's a phone that we made that talks to the software we made that helps IT managers talk to the other software we made. It may just be the that hardware portion will just be any device, whether it's a BlackBerry from 2-3 years ago, or an iPhone, or or an Android. It doesn't matter.
Which is the plan. Like, we've been talking about BlackBerry not being a hardware company since we've been podcasting. I think that next phase that you're articulating is not just saying they're no longer a hardware company, but talking about the other things that they're doing in terms of services and software and mobility being what mobile extending beyond a smartphone to the smart bed, or connected monitors and all these alert systems and all these devices that are running QNX, that if they could talk to each other and talk to a centralized cloud system, could really do some amazing things. So I think
eventually happen, right?
Yeah, it's a great thing, like, because even though BlackBerry can't turn on the world right now of all the devices running QNX, it's not like people are choosing a platform other than QNX for all these software running pieces of hardware, right? So if they can slowly work IoT into the stream, they're really well positioned to do something about that. But yeah, they'll no longer be that traditional mobile company that we've known for years. And even then they weren't. Even then they just sold the hardware. They had to be a hardware provider to sell their services, which was data encryption and communication and security. It's just now they don't have to produce the hardware to do that.
And the consumer side of things, for a while was more or less a happy accident. It was they never wanted or intended to be a consumer hardware company the way that
Well, for a while they proactively avoided it, and then they looked at the numbers and saw how many people were like kind of using BBM and the hand-me-down device effect. But that's the story of mobility, right?
Mm-hmm.
This enterprise, the computers to personal computers. People make one thing for business. It's the more advanced tech than the average consumer wants it, and then you get the BlackBerry Pearl, and so yeah, I think it's back to their kind of core culture. But it's still early. It's phase 2 of what is an endless series of phases to connect these things, right? So right now, the most advanced innovation division of healthcare in Canada looks a lot like an enterprise did in the mid-2000s, where you have people using smartphones to talk to each other in a way that's useful. which can have a dramatic impact on patient care. Like I'm not dismissing the fact that there are still doctors who are using pagers who have to find
There's tons of them because they're faster and they are cheaper and they're generally they don't need to be two-way communication devices.
Well,
my aunt at Sick Kids Hospital still uses a pager.
Yeah.
Because it's a cost thing too. It's really expensive to buy every doctor and every nurse and every admin assistant in a hospital a $400 smartphone.
Yeah, but the problem is that those nurses and those doctors, when they're not using pagers, are using their personal phones to send text messages and private healthcare information to each other, which is a big bad no-no. Also, there's this. I linked to the BlackBerry did a piece about it. It's not just being able to receive alerts; it's the ability to kind of triage and smartly deal with that. Because if you receive a page or a broadcast alert for every time there's a patient request, like if every nurse in the hospital gets that, you start tuning out the alerts. There's like alert fatigue. So to only receive the information when you need it to know that there's a situation because these smart beds and other systems are working is huge for patient care.
Right.
But it's just, it's just so early.
So, BlackBerry conclusion, doing okay. Not going anywhere just yet.
Still going according to plan.
I'm gonna stop it there today. Thank you so much for listening. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. You are always an awesome guest to have, and we'll have you back again soon now that you have a decent mic.
Right on. Well, thanks for having me. I have a good time chatting with you guys for sure.
And Douglas, you're the man. Thanks for being here every Thursday, bright and early.
I'll live to
everybody, thanks so much for checking us out. If you enjoyed this podcast, give us some stars, hopefully 5 on the iTunes store or wherever you found this.
Post a comment on your review. Let us know why or if you'd live in Manitoba.
And if you are listening in Manitoba, let us know if you are going to buy that total internet package. We're really interested in learning more about the people who make up that fine province. That's our show today. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.